Hey, everybody, this is Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to the debut live of System Update. Because it's our first attempt to actually do a live and have an interactive Q&A session with people who are watching, I'm sure there's going to be multiple things that will go wrong. In fact, right when I started speaking, we were on mute, so that was already the first thing, and I'm sure there's a lot more to come. And if you look at it the right way, that should be part of what makes this entertaining. So I'm really excited about being able to use this new medium. I've been at Rumble for roughly 2 months now. It is something that I've been considering as a supplement to the written reporting that I do at Substack. And I want to talk a little bit about what my experience has been here at Rumble and why I consider these kinds of independent free speech platforms like Rumble and like Substack for written journalism and commentary to be so crucial, not just crucial for the ability of people like me to earn a living while free of corporate constraints and without being captive to anyone's orthodoxies or pieties or commands, but actually a really important cause in general for the society, for journalism, for politics, and for the culture. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what Rumble is, and a lot of it has been cultivated deliberately by people who feel threatened by it. Typically, whenever there are defamatory or false mythologies being disseminated about a new or newish platform, it's because people regard it as menacing, and that's a really good thing. I'm glad people regard it as menacing, and I think they should. The day that we announced that we were coming here, about a couple of months ago, and I came with several other real independent voices that I have a lot of respect for, like former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who is now here, the comedian and culture commentator Bridget Fetisi, my long-term journalistic colleague Zed Jelani, and others. There was an article in the Washington Post about the fact that we were moving here. And if you read the article in the Washington Post, the entire purpose of that article, although it adopted the tone of journalistic objectivity that they always adopt in order to conceal what their true agenda is, you can see what the only purpose of it was, which was to disparage and demean Rumble, precisely because it's a rapidly growing platform that is a competitor not just to the Washington Post, but to the entire ability of corporate media outlets to maintain hegemony and monopolistic control over our discourse. And so one of the things that article did, and I actually did a video of it, was one of my first videos here, was they needed to tell their audience what is Rumble. They're as they were reporting on my moving here with Tulsi and others. And they themselves can't disparage Rumble because they have to pretend that they have no agenda. That's the fraud of corporate media that pretty much everyone sees through now, but they nonetheless maintain. And so what they did was really interesting, and I think extremely important to think about. They, instead of disparaging Rumble themselves, recruited someone who they presented as an independent expert. So an expert, just somebody who floats above the entire political landscape, who has no vested interest in any of these debates. They're neither right nor left. They have no political values. They're just specialists, people with very high levels of knowledge, very studious, just the kind of people who you can trust, says the Washington Post. And they're not there to mislead you or to guide you. They're just there to tell you the truth. That's what makes them experts. And this person that they got, they presented as an expert in disinformation and online radicalism and online extremism. And they devoted the last 4 paragraphs of this article, this Washington Post article about our move to Rumble, to allowing this person basically to say that Rumble is this right-wing sewer of disinformation, that there's all kinds of anti-vax and other dangerous content here, that you can't trust it, that it's harmful, that it's dangerous. Made Rumble sound really scary. And if you actually go and look at who this person is, this objective, neutral, apolitical expert who was presented by the Washington Post as the person on whom you are supposed to rely to understand what Rumble is, they work for an organization which, surprise, surprise, is funded by and works in close association with Facebook and Google and various security state agencies in the United Kingdom and the United States, and is funded by the same small billionaires that are funding all of these groups that are supposedly here to protect us so benevolently from misinformation and disinformation. So in other words, the expert whom they presented as the person who was going to trash Rumble as an unreliable sewer of disinformation was herself somebody who works for an organization that takes money from Google, the owner of YouTube, the principal competitor to Rumble. And of course, none of that was disclosed. There was just a reference in passing to the fact that this person had worked or done work for Google, but no mention of the fact that all their financing came from the very institutions that are designed to discredit anything that is free and is emancipated and is liberated from the tyranny of big tech, from the orthodoxies of liberal corporate media and everything else. And you can get angry about that if you want. I actually was really grateful for it because it provided an excellent opportunity to understand one of their core propaganda techniques, these corporate media outlets, which is they have an entire industry of people who are there to make you think that they're experts who have no vested interest in the outcome of the debate, when in reality, few people have more of a vested interest in the outcome of what they're speaking on than these experts that are paraded around by these news outlets. So, though I think it was the first video I did breaking down the Washington Post kind of temper tantrum about the fact that we can all congregate here without them being able to do anything about it. That's in reality what makes them so angry. The fact that they know that all of you have lost faith and trust, justifiably so, in the things that they're saying and doing, and they're desperate to do something about that, because if they don't have that, if they don't have the ability to put things in your brain that they want to be there, then they're losing their power. And it's that desperate awareness that their power is seeping away as a result of the emergence of these independent sites that's causing all of these temper tantrums, these attacks on platforms they can't control, this growing agitation for greater and greater censorship, the disparagement of these sites as something that you're supposed to ignore. So what's really interesting is I've been here for 2 months. I've heard now this kind of narrative that formed that is being disseminated by a lot of people, for example, on the left, who think that they're very independent minded and who are free of the manipulations of the corporate media that they know is bad and therefore don't listen to, and yet in reality end up reciting so much of what they're fed from that corporate media all the time. But it also comes from people in the media as well. So if you look at what is being said about Rumble on the one hand versus the reality of it on the other, in that huge breach, in that huge chasm, you can see how often disinformation comes not from independent sites like Rumble or Substack, but from the very corporate media outlets and employees of media corporations who claim that they are the ones who are combating disinformation. They are actually the primary and most aggressive disseminators of disinformation. So the thing I've been hearing about Rumble is the following. Rumble, they say, is a right-wing site. It's here only to promote a particular right-wing ideology, a kind of new right, make America great, pro-Trump platform, that it is owned by right-wing billionaire Peter Thiel, along with the pro-Trump Senate candidate J.D. Vance, both of whom have venture capital funds that, according to this narrative, have taken control of Rumble and are here to make Rumble a propaganda outlet for the right. And that anybody who is here, like me, who is producing videos or speaking freely with you without their ability to control or interfere, is basically just a puppet for Peter Thiel, a right-wing billionaire. That's the narrative that you can hear wherever you go. If you mention Rumble, that is what you're going to hear. That there are no checks or editorial scrutiny on what is said here, and therefore people can speak freely, and that produces disinformation. That's something you're going to hear as well. Now, the reality of Rumble is so fascinating, principally because it's so wildly disparate from this concoction, this fabrication, this lie, this false narrative that has been manufactured in order to disparage it, precisely because they can't control it. Rumble is a platform that was actually founded in 2013 by a Canadian liberal, just sort of a liberal in the normal sense of that word, And he is the person who isn't just the founder, but also is still the CEO. He still runs Rumble. And the idea behind Rumble, when it was created, was not that it was going to promote a particular ideology or even be political at all. The purpose of Rumble was that YouTube, owned by Google, was abandoning small-time content creators. So people who have farms and like to produce videos of animals and how you raise animals, or people who are chefs and like to do videos on food, who don't have huge audiences, who aren't Taylor Swift or pop stars, and therefore aren't of interest anymore to Google's YouTube. It was a place where small-time creators could come and monetize their videos and earn a decent living producing interesting content and do so freely. And that is how Rumble grew rapidly in the last 8 years. And then suddenly in 2020, as the large social media sites, the monopolies like Facebook and Google, began to crack down on political speech in anticipation of the 2020 election, because they wanted to make sure that the outcome of that election was what they wanted, namely the defeat of Donald Trump and the victory of the Democratic Party. They began cracking down on political speech. Large numbers of people who are on the right, including members of Congress, who started getting squeezed, whose freedom of discourse and inquiry and speech were being restricted by these big tech monopolies, began migrating to Rumble and took an enormous audience with them. And as a result, Rumble had a huge explosion in growth in 2020 and an even bigger explosion in growth in 2021. And it is true that there are a lot of conservatives here on Rumble, but that's not because Rumble itself is a right-wing site. It's because Rumble is a free speech site. It is here to ensure that we can have communication, that journalists like me can do reporting and commentary and analysis, and no one can censor me. I don't have to care or worry about what some corporate overlords or Mark Zuckerberg or Google artificial intelligence machines are analyzing about what I'm saying, out of fear that I'm going to be deplatformed or silenced. It's a free speech platform, not just for people on the right, but for anybody, including probably especially people who are critics of the establishment, whether from the left or the right. And that's the reason why people like Congresswoman Gabbard, who, whatever you think of her, is hardly some right-wing figure. She used to be the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. She resigned in protest over how they were cheating for Hillary Clinton, supported Bernie Sanders in 2016, was a Democratic congresswoman from Hawaii for 8 years. But that is the narrative that got created. And that's what they do anytime there's something they can't control. They either try and impose censorship on it through the brute force of law, or through social scorn by saying, if you allow these voices on these platforms, we're going to destroy your reputation. It's a thuggish and bullying form of censorship campaigns to try and either force these companies to capitulate or shame them in society until they feel like it's not worth the price anymore for them to allow free speech. And precisely because the same reason that they find platforms like Rumble and Substack so threatening is exactly the reason I find it so crucial. For me, if there's people try and put political labels on me all the time. When I first began writing about politics in 2005, I was a critic of the war on terror. So I got called a far leftist. And then when President Obama took over in 2009 and continued many of the same policies he had campaigned on and pledged to vow, and I became a critic of his, I got called all kinds of names as well. And then in 2016, when I saw the utter scam that was Russiagate and began dissenting from almost all of my colleagues in the media about this obviously false concocted conspiracy theory that came from the CIA. Now I get called right wing. It's every name in the book. But what I actually am more than anything else is a civil libertarian. I'm somebody who believes that free speech, not just as a constitutional value, but as a societal value, is the prerequisite to achieving anything. That if our thoughts and our discourse aren't free, then we ourselves will never be free, not just in terms of our behavior, but even our thought patterns, even our actions. And so when I left The Intercept, the media outlet that I co-founded and that was built on my name last year, because they censored an article that I wanted to write that was incriminating of Joe Biden a couple of weeks before the election, and went to Substack and then saw the success of that platform precisely because it was offering journalists like me the ability to write and speak freely and to communicate directly with my readers with no corporate or governmental mediation. I realized that not just for me personally in my career and my work were platforms like this of the highest importance, but for society generally. And that is why I decided that whatever work I do from now on in journalism, in my commentary, in any kind of content I create, I'm going to do it in a way that's designed to fortify platforms like Substack and platforms like Rumble. Now, as you might have read, within the last 48 hours, Rumble made one of its most important acquisitions. It purchased a platform called Locals that itself was enabling journalists and writers and content creators to have a very personal and interactive community building platform with their readers and with their audience. And I now have a Locals channel here. I'm going to be exploring a lot more the kinds of things that it offers. There is a new podcasting app called Callin, Callin, that is similarly designed to allow people to create their own podcast and not have to worry as long as they abide by the terms of service, which are very consistent with the free speech ideology, that they're going to be censored because they've expressed the wrong opinion or alienated somebody. It is growing now as well. It's only these kinds of platforms that I am ever going to work with because I want to weaken and undermine and subvert the corporate media outlets that are there to deceive and propagandize you and to contaminate our public discourse with propaganda and lies and disinformation while they're pretending to fight disinformation. And at the same time, I want to fortify and strengthen and help grow using my platform and the platform of other journalists like me, these kinds of platforms, ones here on Rumble, the one at Substack, Callin, and other places like that. So I consider the work that I'm doing here not just part of my journalism, but really a cause. And I find it so interesting how so many people are threatened by any platform like this that allows just nothing more than the ability to speak freely. It's amazing how threatening that is to people. Although if you think about it for just a minute, it shouldn't be that surprising. This ability to control what we think and what we say is an extraordinarily important power for the ruling class, for prevailing status quo centers of power. That's a power that they've worked to preserve for centuries, the ability to control who can say what. And because we have a legal framework in the United States under the First Amendment that prevents direct government censorship, they've invented all kinds of other ways to engage in censorship without running afoul of that amendment, including social stigma and social scorn, threats that come from the government to Facebook and Google that if they don't censor more in accordance with the Democratic Party's wishes, they will suffer legal and regulatory reprisals. All of this is going on at the same time that there's this new part of the media ecosystem emerging that really is not about one ideological camp or the other, but is about defending these values that come from the Enlightenment, these values of free discourse, of free inquiry, the ability to question and dissent from authorities and their decrees without being punished. And, I'm going to get to your questions in just a little bit. I see them all popping up. I'm super appreciative of the people who have done that. I consider the main purpose of these lives to be interactive. I just want to share a few thoughts since I am live about what I'm doing here and why I think it's so important before I move there. These values are ones that I do think transcend ideology. The ability to restore faith and trust in journalism, which I consider to be crucial, depends upon the ability for people to start believing again that there are those who report the news who are just there to tell the truth as best as they can. And in order to do that, we need an ecosystem that means we're immune from those kinds of punishments, those kinds of cancellations, those kinds of pressure campaigns. And you see more and more the emergence of voices that are completely free And that's why the corporate media and their allies in the political world are being driven increasingly crazy. Now, I just want to talk about one other thing. And I see that there are these Rumble rants. I don't quite know how they work entirely, and I'm not yet an expert in monitoring them as I speak. I'm going to get better at it. I just want to make one more point. So I really appreciate everybody who's been putting those in as well as questions. I want to talk a little bit about this spectacle, this kind of made for TV show to which we've been subjected over the past 2 or 3 weeks, starring this person who's being called a Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, because in this spectacle that has been engineered and orchestrated by very adept and powerful and well-financed people, I think you see the agenda that is at work. So here you have somebody who created this kind of journalistic drama that she took all these documents from a major corporation, a powerful corporation, and it's true she did that. And these documents are in the public interest to some extent. They do provide us with some understanding of a very potent monopoly called Facebook. I guess it's now called Meta. As of today, they changed their name for some reason. And it does tell us some things about how that corporation works, and there's some details we didn't know. But the reality is there's nothing in these documents that are particularly revealing that we didn't previously know. So why has it made such an impact? I mean, when I worked with Edward Snowden in 2013, my source, the reason that created such an enormous consequence, such an enormous impact, was because no one knew until we did that reporting based on the documents he provided me that the NSA had essentially created a program under President Obama to spy on the entire internet, to convert the internet from this tool of liberation into this tool of unprecedented control and monitoring and oppression. And all these programs that we were able to export, no one, even in Congress, knew they existed. And in fact, 4 months before we began doing the reporting, James Clapper, who was President Obama's senior national security advisor, his director of national intelligence, went before the Senate and was asked by a senator, Ron Wyden, does the NSA collect huge amounts of data on millions of Americans? And he looked the senator, and therefore you, in the eye, and he blatantly lied. And he said, no, sir. And it was then that Edward Snowden decided, with certainty, he was already close, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, to come forward with these documents and prove that Clapper had lied, that in the dark, with no democratic deliberation, the NSA had, in fact, been doing exactly what James Clapper, to the Senate, criminally denied that they were doing. And that's what a whistleblower is somebody who reveals to the world highly consequential secrets that had been hidden by power centers. That's what Julian Assange does. And look at how real whistleblowers are treated. Edward Snowden has been in exile in Russia for the last 8 years, where he has asylum because the United States indicted him and has made very clear that if he steps 1 foot outside of Russia, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Julian Assange has spent the last decade in detention, including 2 years in a very harsh prison in the UK, because the United States government is trying to prosecute him and extradite him to the United States to put him in a cage for the rest of his life for the crime of exposing crimes by the United States government and the Democratic Party during the 2016 election. That's how whistleblowers are treated. That's what whistleblowers are. So you can do the semantic debate if you want about whether Frances Haugen counts as a whistleblower. She took some documents, she provided some insight we didn't already know. Call her a whistleblower if you want. But obviously, the reason she's generated so much excitement and attention isn't because of these extraordinary revelations that we didn't know before. There are none. We all knew that Instagram was contributing to anxiety disorders in teenage girls because of body insecurities, the way the music industry and the film industry and Hollywood and the modeling industry and the fashion industry have done for decades. None of that is new. What's new is that you have this very telegenic, scripted hero, this martyr, this high-tech Joan of Arc, who's supposedly ready to be martyred by having confronted this powerful corporation. But what's happening to Frances Haugen? She's not in a high-tech or high-security prison in London the way Julian Assange is. She's not forced into exile in Russia the way Edward Snowden is. She's, to the contrary, being feted around the world. She's in London not to be in prison the way Assange is, but to testify before the UK Parliament that wants to pass a law making it a crime for any social platform like Facebook to publish what the British government deems foul or dangerous material. And the entire network around Frances Haugen, as an article I wrote this week documents, is being financed by billionaires like Pierre Omidyar. You have a new group this week by the billionaires George Soros and Reid Hoffman to combat disinformation. All of this is about creating a narrative, an industry that says that Facebook and Google, probably two of the most powerful corporations ever to exist, certainly the most powerful corporations to exist in the West when it comes to disseminating information, are so dangerous that they need to be brought under control. And who is going to control them? This isn't about breaking up Google and Facebook and smashing them into pieces and making them weaker, which would be justifiable. This is about preserving the strength of Facebook and Google and transferring control of it from the shareholders and executives of those companies who founded it and run it and who own it to the corporate media that is agitating for more censorship, and the government, which is currently controlled by one party, the Democratic Party, which controls both houses of Congress, the White House, and the executive branch. And this entire spectacle is a fraud designed to let this person go around the world as though she has unique authority to opine on what's best for our society in order to build a superstructure above Facebook and Google that transfers control of what can and can't be heard on the internet from those companies to this superior force that ultimately will be run by the government and be in alignment with the corporate media. That's what's going on with this Facebook whistleblower. And again, it relates to why platforms like the one we're now gathered on and talking in order to talk are so critical, because the way that we can emancipate ourselves from this centralized control is through independent platforms. It's interesting. It's been 8 years since I did the Snowden reporting. And oftentimes, even to this very day, people think that reporting was mostly about the invasion of privacy that the United States government under President Obama, the NSA, had perpetrated. And it definitely was in large part about the invasion of privacy. But what it really was about more than anything was defending a free internet, an internet that is free of centralized corporate and government control. That's what made the internet such an exciting technology when it first emerged in the mid-90s. If you go and read the articles that were triumphalist about why the internet was such an important innovation, it was because it was going to enable citizens to communicate directly without this mediation from corporate and governmental power. And NSA spying and now online censorship is a direct threat to that model. And I see this cause of fortifying independent outlets like this one, ensuring that we as human beings remain free to do journalism and debate and speak and create ideas and dissent without being punished, is very much in alignment with the work I did back in 2013, also in defense of a free internet, when I did the reporting on the NSA story. So that kind of ties together why I'm here, why I'm excited about the work I've been doing on Substack for a year, why I'm super excited about the video reporting we've done on Rumble, the new apps like Callin, the ability now that we have with locals that has been integrated into Rumble that we're going to be exploring and building in community. You can check out our page there as well. And I'm now going to do my best. I am not a Twitch streamer. I am not somebody who has practiced both speaking and going through these comments in order to, in a very elegant way, answer them. So I'm now going to do my best. I see here that we have roughly 8,000 people or so watching, which is an amazing audience for our first time, given that we've been here only for 2 months. It's a hugely impressive number of people. So let me go through here. I see a lot of people who are asking questions about Russiagate and its relationship to how all of this kind of integrates, which I think is a really important question. It's probably something that I should have talked about. And also about Omidyar and what his role was with the Intercept. So let me take those two questions. I see a lot of comments on that, including by people who have commented using this Rumble Rants feature that enables these colored ones to appear that make it easier for me to see. So let me address a couple of those points. Russiagate is the thing that really separated me, along with a couple of the journalists for whom I have the most respect, like my colleague Matt Taibbi, as well as a couple of young independent journalists who risked their careers in order to do dissent on Russiagate, like Aaron Mate and Michael Tracy. It was really the thing that created what I probably regard as a permanent breach and separation between myself and the corporate media that kind of always viewed me in this very ambivalent way. I always had one foot in their world. They had to give me a Pulitzer in 2014. I worked at The Guardian, which is an old and established newspaper. I spent the last 7 years at an outlet funded by a billionaire, but I always obviously had one foot outside of that world too. And with my dissent in Russiagate, it really expelled me. And in some sense, I actually kind of self-evicted or self-deported from that world because I saw just how fundamentally rotted it was. And what made it so disturbing to me was not just that it was an obviously fake conspiracy theory. It was kind of something that was dug up from the basement archives of the CIA using some old, crusty Cold War script about how we had to be afraid of all these people who were clandestine agents of the Kremlin. They couldn't even invent a new crazy conspiracy theory. They insulted us by using one that was 60 years old. And the idea that anyone who opposed the Democratic Party was a clandestine agent of the Kremlin. It wasn't that it was just a fake conspiracy theory. We've been subjected to a lot of those. It was that it came from the CIA and the permanent security state services, which, and this isn't me saying this, it was Dwight Eisenhower who in 1961, after serving 8 years as president, before which he was a 5-star general who won World War II for the United States, so no radical was he, had 15 minutes on network television when he was finally retiring and leaving after serving 2 terms as president to warn Americans about what he thought they needed to know after having seen all the stuff that he saw. And what he chose to warn Americans about was the deep state. He didn't call it that. That term hadn't yet been invented in academia. He called it the military industrial complex. But the concept was exactly the same, which is that when you have a standing army, which we were never supposed to have, a permanent military, not a group that of people, of citizens who band together in time of war and then disband, but a permanent military that becomes the centerpiece of American government. And then around that, you build a security apparatus of spying and the dark arts of propaganda and disinformation, which is what the CIA always was intended to be and still is. And then you combine that with the private sector, this fusion of government, deep state power, and private sector power. You create this monster that, in the words of Dwight Eisenhower, becomes more powerful even than the elected leader of the United States, the most powerful person in the free world, the president of the United States. They're more powerful than he is. And Eisenhower's warning was before the Vietnam War, which obviously increased their power even more so, this 13-year sprawling war. And it was before 9/11, which really solidified and expanded by many magnitudes the power and authority of the security services. And so they are more dangerous and more powerful than ever. And they were not neutral in the 2016 election. If you go and look at who supported Hillary Clinton, one of the most revealing things was that it was both the the previous Democratic CIA director and the previous Republican CIA director, who both wrote op-eds, one in the New York Times, one in the Washington Post, right before the 2016 election, effectively endorsing Hillary Clinton. Obama's acting CIA chief, Michael Morrell, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, I support Hillary Clinton for president because Donald Trump is an asset of the Kremlin. And Michael Hayden, who was both the head of the NSA and the CIA for George Bush and Dick Cheney, also said he wasn't going to endorse Hillary Clinton, but he effectively did by warning that Donald Trump was a pawn of Vladimir Putin. So this storyline grew out of these security services, and they laundered it through the corporate media. And the reason they did that was because during the campaign, Trump was questioning the orthodoxies that if you want to be a major politician in the United States, you're not supposed to question. He asked why it is that we're still in NATO, a military alliance that was created to defend against a threat that for decades has no longer existed, the Soviet Union. He asked why we were constantly going around the world changing the governments of countries where we have no interest in who rules their country, like in Syria. Why, he asked, were we working to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad instead of working with the Syrian government and the Russian government against our common enemies, meaning Al-Qaeda and ISIS? He was challenging all the time the fundamental matrix that propped up their power. And because of that, they set out to destroy him and to sabotage his presidency and undermine it. And they worked in partnership with the corporate media in order to do it. The media that's supposed to be a watchdog over them instead became their servant. And as I always say, and I've repeatedly referred to this video and I've shown it many times, it was almost like an accident, like something broke in the matrix, where a truth that is never supposed to be spoken was instead revealed. It was about a week before Donald Trump was to be inaugurated in January of 2017. Chuck Schumer went onto the Rachel Maddow show. And that day, Donald Trump had mocked the CIA for getting Iraq wrong because he was angry that the CIA was clearly trying to sabotage his presidency before it began by saying that he was in bed with Vladimir Putin. And so he began to attack the CIA back. And Chuck Schumer went on the Rachel Maddow show, and Rachel Maddow said, what about what Donald Trump is doing? He's sitting here mocking the CIA. And Chuck Schumer said, you know, Rachel, ethics aside, for a very smart businessman that he thinks he is, this is a really dumb thing for him to be doing, because everyone in Washington knows that if you take on the CIA that's supposed to be subservient to our elected president, part of the executive branch, he said, if you take on the CIA, even if you're the president, they have 6 different ways to Sunday to get back at you. Chuck Schumer described and revealed the existence of a deep state. That's what a deep state is, a center of power outside of democratic accountability that no democratically elected leaders can challenge without being destroyed. Chuck Schumer described it, admitted it. He said, everyone in Washington knows you don't do what Donald Trump's doing, confronting the CIA, because they will destroy you. And the next 4 years of the Trump presidency was dominated by little more than these unelected bureaucrats and security state goons and authoritarians inside the US government who have never been elected to anything, working hand in hand with liberal corporate media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and Atlantic and the New Yorker and several others, obviously CNN and NBC News, feeding them one false claim after the next. I could spend the rest of the live and keep you here until 1 a.m. listing them all, from Trump having a secret server with Alpha Bank, to Russians putting bounties on the heads of U.S. soldiers and Trump ignoring it, to there being a secret weapon that Russia invented from the 25th century that allows them to impose brain injuries on American soldiers, and Trump did nothing about it, to Donald Trump Jr. had advanced access to the WikiLeaks archives. Just one lie after the next. Like, you can't even keep track of them, but they're all major lies. And so what that was an effort on the part of the permanent power faction in Washington, including the media, to cling to their control and power, because they knew that Donald Trump, and I'm not saying this, you don't have to think positively about him or negatively about him in order to recognize that he was a disruptive force. That's why he drove them all crazy. They all fundamentally and radically reconstituted themselves simply in reaction to Trump, to stop Trump, because he was such a disruptive force in their mind. And that union that formed was incredibly pernicious, in my view, because for all the talk that they were engaged in, all the self-righteous kind of speechifying they were doing about the virtues and values and necessity of democratic values, here they were engaged in the most anti-democratic conduct possible of manipulating and propagandizing and deceiving the American public by working with media outlets who are supposed to serve as a check on that, and the security services, because they didn't like the outcome of the 2016 election and then repeated that in 2020. And so when I look at these institutions, these media outlets that still call themselves journalism, like NBC News and MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post and Atlantic and the Atlantic and the New Yorker, to say nothing of the sewer of digital liberal outlets that are all failing, the Huffington Post, Fox, Vice, Vulture, Gizmodo, New York Magazine, Daily Beast, all of those, this kind of gigantic sewer of homogeneity and like-minded hive behavior. Of course, not only do I want nothing to do with them, I do regard them as my adversaries or even my enemies. I began to view my project not just as a critic of them, but as somebody who wanted to work actively to subvert them, because maybe I had never realized it before, or maybe it was actually true that they did transform, but I began to view them as a serious threat to the political values and the journalistic values in which I most believe, and that really did reorient my career. See a couple of a few questions about Pierre Midyar, and then I also have a few questions that I see here that one of my colleagues has sent me as he's been monitoring. So let me just talk about Pierre Midyar, although I only want to do that a little bit, and I only want to do it for a little bit for this reason, which is I actually just wrote an article at Substack where I talked a great deal about Pierre Midyar and my experiences with him in working with him in creating the Intercept. He was the primary funder and still is of the Intercept, the media outlet at which I worked from 2013 when we founded it until 2020, until I resigned. He's the primary funder of this network of Democratic Party operatives who are coaching and engineering this Facebook whistleblower. So I don't want to repeat that. You can go and read that article. It's open to the public, that article. You can read everything I had to say. And I wanted to be very transparent about the fact that obviously, in order to be heard, you do need, in a capitalist society, financing. You need funders. And what you have to make sure that you're always doing is insulating yourself from their influence and control. So what I had always done throughout my journalism career, I didn't go to journalism school. I didn't begin my career by going to Columbia Journalism School and then going to the New York Times or NBC News and being indoctrinated about how to do journalism. I began in a very unconventional way. I just created a blog one day in 2005 to say what I wanted to say. And so for me, journalism was always about freedom. I opened my blog each day and I wrote what I wanted to say. And I gained credibility with my audience because I was very scrupulous about what I was saying, and they came to trust and have confidence in what I was telling them. Even when they disagreed or when I disagreed with them, they knew I was going to be honest with them. And that built an enormous trust with my audience. And so what I was able to do when I negotiated my deals with media outlets was my deal with each one, first Salon and The Guardian and then The Intercept, was I will come and work with you only if you agree that I can write whatever I want. No one tells me what to write. And that what I write will be published onto the internet before any editor touches it or sees it, unless I request editorial monitoring or help in the event of very complex stories. But that's my decision to make. And that was the deal that Salon and The Guardian and The Intercept both all made with me, and they always honored it until two weeks before the 2020 election, when for the first time the Intercept's editors came to me and said, this story that you want to publish about Joe Biden, we're not going to let you publish. And as I said in this article, I don't blame Pierre Midyar for that. I actually believe that he adhered to his word to never interfere in the editorial product that we were producing. But the problem with billionaire funding is that when an organization relies upon billionaire funding, they know that if that billionaire ends up displeased, they are going to lose their funding and therefore lose their job. And ultimately and inevitably, even if there's not a lot of attempt to do it, those outlets are going to start to be reflective of the ideology and political outlook of their billionaire funders. And that's what I think is so important. I don't want to personalize this to Pierre Omidyar. I want to make clear that the small handful of billionaires who are funding these campaigns to control the internet under these benevolent and neutral sounding banners of fighting disinformation and fighting extremism, like George Soros and Reid Hoffman and Pierre Omidyar, are very, very political. They are very ideological actors. They all were obsessed, for example, with Russiagate, with believing this conspiracy theory and using their wealth to spread it. They were obsessed monomaniacally with the idea that the American experiment would die unless Donald Trump was destroyed. And so when you hear concepts like disinformation and misinformation and hate speech and fake news, they're designed to sound like these are neutral concepts, like I began by talking about with these experts who are presented to you as though they're objective. But in reality, they're fused with all kinds of subjective political and ideological preferences and agendas that in particular is being shaped by a small number of billionaires, the ones I just named. And I can't think of anything more threatening to a free internet than allowing billionaires like that to shape and control how the policing of the internet is done. But that is absolutely their intention. So let me look at some of these other questions that have come up here. I think, as I said, I've been doing videos on Rumble for two months now. I think we've covered a lot of really interesting topics. I found that there are things that you can do in journalism with video by showing graphics and video that can't be expressed with the written word. So I encourage you to look at the videos that we have produced so far. I, again, want to thank the people I'm seeing here who have donated to the chat. Somebody asked me about Omidyar's closing of access to various leaks. I've addressed this before too, so I don't want to take up too much time with it. But what I will say about Pierre Omidyar is what I just said, which is that when we agreed to take funding from him in 2013, our unconditional demand was that he have no role whatsoever in the editorial decision-making of the media outlet we were creating. And he agreed to that. And we told him the minute there's even a hint that you're attempting to interfere in any of our journalism will be the day that we all quit. And he actually kept his word. Any of the decisions that the Intercept has made, any of the shitty journalism that they published, any of the questionable ethical conduct in which they've engaged is really not the fault of Pierre Omidyar. It's really the fault of the senior editorial team that was put into place at the Intercept, led by its editor-in-chief, Betsy Reed, who is a kind of standard left liberal. She was at The Nation for 10 years. You see where her politics come from. She has no understanding of or belief in what the mission was that we were creating, which was to be an independent journalistic outlet that was adversarial to centers of power and not there to serve the Democratic Party. So the closing of the Snowden files was not something that Pierre Omidyar decided to do. It was something that we all decided collectively to do because we had been reporting on the Snowden archive for 5 years. We published thousands, if not tens of thousands, of top secret documents. There were other media outlets with much bigger budgets, like the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the New York Times, that had large parts of the Snowden archive that stopped publishing them years before the Intercept stopped because it was so expensive to do that work. You had to build this gigantic security room, keep those files very secure. You needed teams of lawyers and technologists to review the archive, teams of journalists combing through the documents. And we got to the point where we felt like we had published almost every major story from that archive, and that the money we were spending on these stories that were very difficult to publish after 5 years were being read by almost nobody. Interest in these dark documents had waned, and that the money would be better spent on other forms of journalism. No one told us to close the archive. There was just a story published in the Daily Beast by Spencer Ackerman in partnership with Laura Poitras that use new Snowden documents, because both she and I have full copies of the archive that are open, that are free to use. So no one has ever closed the Snowden archive. It was a decision by The Intercept that after 5 years of extremely ample reporting on the Snowden files, that our money and time was better spent elsewhere. Question: how long do you think it will take Substack to be the leading source for news, particularly to have a larger audience than mainstream media? I have to admit, I've really begun to change how I think about this, because when I went to Substack, I knew very little about what Substack was. I quit The Intercept very, very impetuously. I had no plans to leave The Intercept. I thought I was going to be able to get my article published, as I always had been able to. And the fact that I realized they weren't going to publish it, I was really going to be censored, made me quit instantaneously with no plan. And so I went to Substack principally because I have colleagues that I know, like Matt Taibbi and Andrew Sullivan, who were there and who encouraged me to go. And I never dreamed that it was going to be a major player in the media ecosystem. And what I found after being there, I would say 2 months, was the number of readers that were reading my articles at Substack with no structure in place supporting what I was doing. No major corporation like The Intercept promoting my work, was double or triple or quadruple the number of people who are reading my articles at The Intercept. And now, a year later, the number of people who are reading my articles at Substack are 8 to 10 times more than the standard article that I publish at The Intercept. And the same is true with Matt Taibbi and his audience at Substack versus his audience at Rolling Stone, one of the biggest and most valuable brand names in journalism. And the same thing is happening with my videos here. Almost every video that we publish here, after just 2 months on the platform, gets close to 200,000 views. The last video I did, the interview I did with former speechwriter Darren Beatty from the Trump White House about the question of what was the FBI's role in January 6th and their use of informants and infiltrators, got 1.3 million views, almost double the number of people who watch CNN in prime time. And I really did start to realize that this hunger for independent media is so great, because we're really now at the point where people, rightfully so, know that they cannot trust the employees who work at these media corporations, because even if they want to do real journalism, they can't. They're enslaved in this cage, in this box. And they're very constrained in what they can and can't say. And everybody knows that. People have been deceived enough by those outlets that they no longer trust them. And they're really now at the point where, unless you're at one of these independent platforms where people know that you can speak freely and that what you're saying is not the byproduct of someone pulling your strings behind you, some invisible puppet master, but is a byproduct of your candor and honesty, because you can speak freely without anyone destroying your reputation or your life or firing you, that's what builds trust. And I believe that these platforms are going to become even more formidable competitors to big tech platforms and corporate media outlets. It may take a little bit of time. It probably will. But the reason I'm here is to do everything I can, everything in my power to help that happen, to accelerate that process. Every day I try and recruit more people who are doing good journalism or who want to do good journalism to come to these platforms, because at least until there's some new technology like crypto or blockchain, and we'll see how that plays out, these kinds of platforms where the founders of the platforms are genuinely committed to the values of free speech and resisting pressures from the New York Times and NBC News to censor because they're called racist or white nationalist or fascist if they don't obey. And I believe that the people running Rumble and Substack and other places like Colin are actually genuinely devoted to that. Then I really do think that these platforms are going to start to provide a serious threat to the hegemony of those other outlets. And I think those other places know that. And that's the reason they wage such vicious war on those of us like me or Matt Taibbi and others who are at these platforms, and wage war on the platforms themselves, because they know it also. how do you feel the algorithms have impacted social media platforms? Yeah, I think, that has become a much more complex question than just what had been the easier question that social media companies are censoring, right? That's an easy debate. Social media companies decide that if you express this view, you cannot be heard. For me, that's a very easy cause. That's a cause in which I passionately believe. The question, though, of them algorithmically promoting or suppressing particular material is one that is very pernicious. Remember that right before the 2020 election, Twitter banned any link to the New York Post articles and reporting about the authentic Hunter Biden documents that raise questions about Joe Biden. Facebook didn't ban those links. They didn't use brute censorship. They used a more insidious form where they announced they were going to algorithmically suppress, prevent the spread of that story. So these outlets are now controlling what gets heard and what doesn't in ways that are more subtle than just censoring. And that's why there's this information war now, where the Democratic Party and its media outlets want to be able to influence and control how these algorithms function. They don't want you, when you sign on to YouTube or Facebook, to read my articles or other people who are criticizing their work. They want you automatically to be captive to the New York Times and CNN. That's what this information war is about. It is about the power of those algorithms and who gets to decide what they suppress and don't. I'm really glad I have a question here about Julian Assange. Specifically, it's why doesn't the UK release Julian? They say it will be dangerous for him to be extradited, but they still keep him locked up in their cage instead without a trial. This is, I think, really worth just taking a second and spending a minute talking about. As you probably remember, the storyline of the Trump years was that Trump was a fascist. It eventually got to the point where they were explicitly comparing him to Adolf Hitler and his followers to the Nazi movement. He was an existential threat to democratic values. The Washington Post flamboyantly adopted a new logo, a slogan called "Democracy Dies in Darkness," the obvious implication of which was that Donald Trump was a threat to press freedom, and the Washington Post was going to stand in defense of democracy by bringing transparency. And yet here we have what is by far the most serious, the gravest threat to press freedom that we've seen, I would say, in the last decade in the West, which is the attempt by the United States government to prosecute Julian Assange for the crime of doing journalism. And I think it's really important to understand who's behind this. The primary agency that hates Julian Assange the most and that wants him destroyed is the CIA, because Assange has been reporting on what the CIA has been doing for over a decade. And remember, the indictment of Julian Assange that they're now using to keep him in prison and try to extradite him did not begin with the Biden administration. It began with the Trump administration. And the person who was most responsible for that indictment was Mike Pompeo, who originally was the director of the CIA under Donald Trump. Mike Pompeo has fooled a lot of people in the world of MAGA and right wing into believing that he's some kind of new Republican, some kind of pro-Trump Republican, and America first foreign policy advocate. He's none of those things. Mike Pompeo is classic deep state. He was a supporter of the CIA, the NSA, going all the way back to the Bush and Cheney administrations. He's very clever. And so he was able to manipulate Trump and others to be blind to who he actually was. And it was Mike Pompeo with the CIA behind him who caused that indictment of Julian Assange to be filed and then unsealed. And it is now the Biden administration using that indictment to try and keep Julian Assange in prison. As far as the question of why the UK is cooperating, it's a very easy answer. It's because the UK is a very weak country. They're very subservient to the United States. It's almost impossible to imagine that the government would defy the United States. It is possible the judiciary might. The judiciary, the British judiciary, has some history of independence, including recent independence. They've refused in the past to extradite defendants that the United States demanded be shipped to the United States, including most famously the accused hacker Lori Love. And the grounds that they used were similar to the ones that the British judge used to refuse the Biden administration's extradition request for Assange, which is that American prisons are so harsh that Assange's physical and mental health can't withstand being put into an American prison. But think about what was said during the Trump years about these attacks on press freedom by Donald Trump. What did Donald Trump do that made these journalists so upset, so petulant, so melodramatic, falling on their fainting couch, claiming their press freedoms were under attack? Remember, Jim Acosta, the most pompous, self-regarding blowhard ever to be employed in any industry, wrote a book, a best-selling book called A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth or something like that, with a picture of him confronting Donald Trump on the cover, and it became a bestseller because stupid, gullible liberals bought it. What was dangerous about Jim Acosta's job? Jim Acosta is a blown dry, manicured, pedicured baby. The only thing that was ever done to him was occasionally Trump would mock him and publish mean tweets about him. And journalists in response would act as though the Constitution was being incinerated before our eyes. It would be a week-long news cycle that Trump had said mean things about journalists. I've been a journalist for 15 years. I have had a lot of mean things said about me by governments around the world, by the US government, by the UK government, by the Brazilian government. I don't regard any of that as an attack on my my press freedoms at all. It's the right of governments to criticize journalists, just like it's our right to criticize them. That's normal. That's healthy. It's not an attack on press freedom. That's being a drama queen and trying to make yourself a victim when in fact you're not. Trump did nothing to any of these journalists. He didn't harm a hair on the head of Jim Acosta. Now you have an actual assault on press freedom. The attempt to keep Julian Assange in prison until he dies. He's been in detention for 8 years, in prison for 2 more. His mental and physical health is deteriorating rapidly. They want to kill him. They want him to die in prison. They don't even care if they prosecute him or convict him or not. And where is the media protesting any of this? They couldn't care less. They barely covered the trial. They never raised their voices in defense. The only person in media who has really ever denounced the persecution of Julian Assange is Tucker Carlson, who spent months putting me on the air to report on the case, who put Assange's brother and father on the air to make the case directly to Trump for a pardon, who put his fiance on the air to do the same, who put celebrities like Roger Waters and Pamela Anderson in order to advocate for Assange. But other than Tucker Carlson, there's basically nobody in the media who gives the slightest shit about what the government is doing to Julian Assange, except to the extent that they're supportive of it. And think about why that is. In part, it's because he's just not part of their clique and never was. But it's really more because in 2016, he committed the ultimate crime. The CIA hates Julian Assange because in 2010, he published reporting about war crimes that were done under Presidents Bush and Obama. But the reason the political class hates him in Washington is not because of what he did in 2010, but because of what he did in 2016, when he published an archive of authentic documents, just like the New York Post did in 2020, of emails from the DNC and John Podesta's email inbox, the chair of the Hillary Clinton campaign, that were extremely incriminating about Hillary Clinton, and that proved that the DNC cheated to help Hillary Clinton defeat Bernie Sanders. And it caused the resignation of the top 5 officials of the DNC. That is whistleblowing. And they believe that that was a major reason why Hillary Clinton lost, was because Julian Assange accurately reported on what the DNC and the Clinton campaign was doing. That's why they're imprisoning him, to punish him for helping the public see the truth about Hillary Clinton. He's essentially a political prisoner. And the other people in the media don't care. And the reason they don't care, besides the reasons I just said, is a psychological reason. Julian Assange is what they pretend to be. He's somebody who has actually courageously sacrificed and risked his own liberty to confront power centers around the world. He has broken more major stories in the last 15 years than all of these employees at these media outlets who hate him combined. He's a real journalist. He's a mirror that is held up that shows them the truth of what they are instead of the branding and imagery they try and maintain. And that's why they hate him and are satisfied to see him rot in prison, even though they spent all those years pretending to be such stalwart defenders of press freedom. Let me go on to a few next questions.
There's two there that are really good.
What are they?
They are both on your WhatsApp chat. One is asking, it's a paid comment, asking if you're more pessimistic or optimistic about the future, and how will Rumble and Substack keep from bending to the profit motive.
What was the second one?
How will Rumble and Substack keep from bending to the profit motive?
Okay, let me ask that. So I have my colleague here who's doing a great job curating for me, and he directed my attention to a couple of questions. The second of which is, how will Rumble and Substack resist bending to the profit motive? And I presume what's meant by that is, it's one of the things that I think people have neglected to acknowledge or appreciate is that when companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter were first created by people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, they didn't set out to be censorship machines. They didn't want to be in the business of censoring political speech and kicking people off their platforms. Why would you start a company and want to start kicking people off your service? You want as many people as possible to use your platform, not reduce the number of people who use it. But even more so, they came out of this kind of ideology I was describing earlier of a free internet. That was the prevailing ideology. You can describe it, I suppose, as kind of libertarian, the idea that the internet was supposed to be this revolutionary, emancipatory invention that would empower citizens. And they really did believe that in their kind of youthful days. They definitely didn't want to be arbiters of political controversies and overseers of our political disputes. There's a thankless job. No matter what you do, you're going to make people angry at you. This was an obligation foisted upon them by a combination of corporate journalists at the New York Times, NBC News, and CNN, who continuously shamed them by saying, we're going to keep calling you a racist. We're going to keep calling you a fascist. We're going to keep calling you a white nationalist. We're going to keep accusing you of aiding and abetting genocide unless you start censoring in accordance with our wishes. We're going to use our megaphones to destroy your reputation unless you comply. And you can blame them or not, but billionaires, despite being billionaires, are also human beings who have to live in the society, and they are susceptible to those kind of pressures. And they began to capitulate gradually and now rapidly to those censorship demands. That's part of why they started doing it. The other part is that the power centers in Washington were similarly telling them, threatening them, that if they didn't start censoring, they would be subjected to punishment, legal and regulatory punishment. But then the other part of it that is really underappreciated is these are now gigantic companies. Facebook has tens of thousands of employees. Twitter has thousands. Google has tens of thousands. No one person can micromanage or even macromanage those companies. You have to delegate power to your workforce. And what's happening inside these companies in Silicon Valley is what's happening in every other organization in America, in corporate America, in academia, in media, which is that an entire new generation of people, beginning with millennials, primarily liberals, do not believe in free speech. They believe that speech with which they disagree is harmful and dangerous and violent and needs to be censored and silenced and combated and suppressed in the name of public safety. That is the warped ideology they believe. And a lot of the pressure is coming from inside of these companies. A lot of the deletions and the censoring at Twitter and Google and Facebook, some of it's from artificial intelligence. A lot of it is from this kind of woke workforce that rebels and does these little uprisings if Twitter and Facebook and Google allows opinions with which they disagree to be heard. They've been trained for years by their parents, at their universities, now at their workplaces, to believe that if they just throw enough of a temper tantrum, they're entitled to be protected from ideas they dislike. That's the culture that's being created and is metastasizing in all of our institutions. And these social media companies are susceptible to that. So then the question is, well, what's different about Rumble and Substack? They might begin with claiming a devotion to free speech values, but aren't they just going to fall prey to the same thing? Maybe they will. But I have gotten to know the people who run both Substack and Rumble, and I've been increasingly talking to people who are now developing other apps like Colin that I've mentioned before, and I do believe that there is now a backlash, a growing recognition of the serious dangers to our society, to our ability to be free human beings from this mentality and climate of repression. And that the people who are running these outlets, these new outlets, are not pretending to be devoted to free speech as a marketing brand only to capitulate at the first instance of pressure, but are truly devoted to it as a cause. And this is what I think is so important, is the more of us who use these platforms, the more of us who raise our voices in support of them and who refuse to be cowed by these other institutions, the stronger they will become, the more of an ability they will have to resist what is definitely these pressures that are already coming for these outlets. Like I mentioned before, as soon as Rumble got some attention, when we moved here, the Washington Post ran an article designed to lie about what Rumble is and to poison people's ideas about what happens on this platform. They did the same thing to Substack. Substack has already brushed them back, and I believe Rumble will as well. What was the first question, Victor?
It was whether or not you're more pessimistic or optimistic about the future compared to 2013.
So, the question is whether I'm more or less optimistic, or whether I'm more pessimistic as I am in 2013. It is hard to say because there's kind of an arms race, is how I would describe it right now, between people on the one hand who want greater repression and tyranny in our culture and our politics, in our academic institutions, in how we live. And then there's another side that wants greater and greater freedom. And each side is developing more and more techniques and tactics and instruments and weapons and technologies in order to advance the vision that they want. I presume that's a common framework in how society works out what it's going to be. And I definitely am extremely, extremely concerned about the fact that as recently as 30 or 40 years ago, free speech was a commonly shared American value. One of the first articles that I ever wrote, you can go back and read it on my old blog, was in 2000 and late 2005, early 2006. There was a prosecution of a professor, David Irving, who was a longtime historian, a British historian who was often accused of being a Holocaust denialist. And in various parts of Europe, Holocaust denialism is actually a crime. If you say things like, I think fewer people than 6 million were killed in the Holocaust, a grotesque and offensive thing to say, in my opinion, a clearly false thing to say. But if you say that in the United States, you cannot be punished by the state. But in European countries, you actually get charged with the crime as though you've robbed somebody, you're broken into someone's house or raped or killed them. You're arrested and you're put on trial, and then you're imprisoned if you're found guilty. And he was found guilty and I think sentenced to 2 years in prison. I wrote an article saying it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right in the United States. This is something that as Americans, we just instinctively are repelled by, because we're inculcated with the idea that it's grotesque for the state to punish you because you've expressed a view that it has declared sufficiently harmful or false. Nobody, regardless of your party or ideology in the United States, wants the power to be vested in an institution to do that. And I believed at the time that was true. I no longer believe that to be true at all. At all. If you raise the banner these days of freedom of speech, you will be accused, implicitly assumed or explicitly accused, of being some kind of sympathizer of fascism or racism. as though the only effective tool to combat white nationalism, racism, fascism is censorship. And therefore, if you're against the only tool available to combat it, it must mean that you are sympathetic to those ideologies. That is the prevailing mindset that is spreading like a virus throughout multiple sectors of society. And that's the thing I worry about most. But what gives me optimism is the fact that I really do believe that inherent to the human condition, to human nature, is a craving to be free. And when you take human beings and constrain them, you can do it to some extent. If you scare them, for example, that they're facing a threat that might harm them, and the only way they can be protected is if they sacrifice their liberty, we'll give up some freedom. But once it gets to the point where it starts to be excessive, where people start to feel like they cannot breathe any longer, they cannot fulfill what it means to be human, a backlash ensues. And it can be a very potent backlash because think about it, just in the most primitive sense, in the most literal sense, if you're constrained by someone or something, at some point you're going to use all your force when there's no other alternative to break the chains of captivity in which you've been placed. And that summoning of force, when it becomes collective, can produce a very powerful backlash. And I think we're seeing the emerging signs of that. And I certainly want to do everything I possibly can to fuel the potency of that backlash, because those chains are completely pernicious. And the ideology behind it is something that needs to be combated. All right, let me try and answer a couple of more. We've gone almost an hour and a half. I think it's a good time. Someone has asked about encryption. I'll try and do some of these quickly. I usually rely on the person I trust most when it comes to questions of digital security, which is Edward Snowden. And he strongly believes, and I've certainly used it over the years, that the app that provides the most security for communication is Signal. It's very easy to install on your telephone. You can use it to chat. You can use it to speak. You can use it to send files. It has real encryption. It's not subject to Facebook or Google. Nothing is perfect. There's no zero risk. But I think that that is a platform that I believe in.
If someone wants to send you sensitive files, how do
there's a question here if someone wants to send me sensitive files. One of the organizations that I've actually created with Edward Snowden, with the whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who also almost went to prison like real whistleblowers do when he leaked the Pentagon Papers, with Laura Poitras, is called the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And it has a technology called Secure Drop, which is very similar to what WikiLeaks pioneered, where people can drop anonymously using encryption secret documents without being traced. We're in the process of installing that on our Substack. We don't have that yet. So in the meantime, you can use email in the first instance just to make contact with me, and I can then give you a safer means of communication through Signal in order to pass information and help you do that in the most secure way possible. The last question I'm going to answer here that I see, and I apologize, we're going to have a much kind of cleaner system for how I'm going to go through these questions in the future. It was a little arbitrary. We did our best. What are my thoughts on Noam Chomsky's recent take of vaccine mandates? So I want to take Noam Chomsky out of that question, only because Noam Chomsky is somebody who has had a lot of influence on how I view journalism and politics. I know there's a caricature of him on the right that I hope people on the right one day will revisit, because he was probably the most important voice in the late 20th century warning about the machinations of the deep state and what American foreign policy was really all about. And at the time, it was extremely unpopular in American conservatism, the conservatism of Ronald Reagan and hawkish foreign policy of Dick Cheney. And there's been a lot of changes in American conservatism, a lot of eye-opening about what these institutions really do. Chomsky is a big and important voice. He's obviously an incredibly important and influential intellectual in revolutionizing modern linguistics at MIT. But politically, he's been an important voice to me, whether you agree with him or not. And he's also become a close friend of mine. I've gotten to know him very well over the years. He's now 92 years old. So I'm not going to spend my time criticizing Noam Chomsky. When I disagree with things he says, as I often do these days, or at least sometimes do, I don't have a problem saying it. I just try and make sure I depersonalize it. So let me just talk about the video that that created controversy last week, where he essentially said, he was asked what should be done with people who are vaccine hesitant. And he said, to him, people who are vaccine hesitant, who refuse to take the vaccine, even if they have good reasons, like they already got COVID and have natural immunity, or they have a health condition that makes them afraid to take it, or they just don't trust Pfizer and the government in their claims. He said those are no different to him than people who just decide that they don't need to abide by traffic lights, that a red light is a constraint on their freedom. And as obviously somebody would be very dangerous to the rest of us if they just went through red lights, they would endanger our lives. That's how Chomsky said he sees the unvaccinated. And just like we take people who run red lights and eventually, if they keep doing it, put them in prison, he said the unvaccinated should be isolated forcibly from society. I guess like put in camps, like concentration camps. And when asked whether or not they should be allowed to work, he said, no, they're going to be destitute and that's going to be their fault. And then when asked, well, how are they going to even eat? He said, well, that's their problem. And then he remembered at the last second that his political ideology actually holds that if you're destitute, the state has a responsibility to feed you. That's been his political ideology for 70 years. And so then he kind of threw on this cursory acknowledgement. Oh, well, I guess, we might as well, I guess we would have to feed them the way we do prisoners. And I think that the point I want to make, taking Chomsky out of it, is this whole punitive discourse that has emerged about the disobedient. Whether you're disobedient because you haven't taken the COVID vaccine because you're not convinced you need to or should, whether you're disobedient because you don't pledge loyalty to the Democratic Party and view Donald Trump and the movement that he mobilized as the greatest threat to democracy since Adolf Hitler, if you're not obedient because you are skeptical of conspiracy theories from the corporate media about Russia and about what happened on January 6th and the attempt to impose a police state in its name, if you're disobedient in any way to these institutions of authority, modern American liberalism is becoming increasingly vindictive and hateful and punitive. And that's where this idea comes from. Just put them in camps, starve them to death. I guess feed them some food to make them barely survive. And I think you're seeing this strain of tyranny, of this kind of fascist mindset. It's so ironic. They believe they're fighting fascism, right? They call themselves Antifa. And yet Antifa itself is a band of people who walk around in the street, not all of them, but some of them, beating up journalists if they don't obey the orders of these thugs not to film on public streets. This is this authoritarian strain that we're seeing emerging through American liberalism, that any form of disobedience means no longer that you're no longer just deplorable. That's what you were 5 years ago. You're now a criminal. You're a terrorist. You're somebody who should be imprisoned, or even, as Ashley Babbitt was, shot and killed. And if that happens to you, you get what you deserve. And I think a lot of the discourse, including that video about the unvaccinated, is reflecting this increasingly alarming and highly coercive mentality that is, in my opinion, the dominant strain of American liberalism, which in turn is the dominant strain in American politics. It's the dominant wing of the Democratic Party, which controls the Senate, the House, the entire executive branch, the White House, the media, and is the prime recipient of funding from both Wall Street and Silicon Valley. So it's not a trivial matter what the attributes of this movement are, which is why I spend so much of my time focused on them. So I think that's going to conclude our debut live session. It was a huge amount of fun, I have to say. I really believe in this model of interacting, and I'm going to try for sure. Like I said at the beginning, this debut meant I was going to explain what this platform is to me and what I'm doing here. I'm going to make sure that the bulk of our time in the future is spent on my being able to answer questions. I'll develop better kind of method for making sure that the questions that you're asking that deserve to be answered are answered. If you asked a question that you thought was too confrontational or scary for me to answer, I promise I wasn't avoiding them. It was just the system we created. Definitely come back. We're going to do this weekly at least. Not at least, we're going to do it weekly, and ask it again. And I'm always, happy to confront and engage with good faith critics. I think it's a really important part of what journalism is, and that's the community that we're trying to build, one that's steeped in that ethos where journalists are independent and free, and most of all, accountable. So thank you very much to everybody who has listened, who has been watching the video reports we've been doing here. Watch for what we do in our community on Locals, which is a page that is now up and running. And especially thank you to those of you who've been reading the reporting I've been doing at Substack over the last year. The people who subscribe there are the ones who really enable me to do the work that I do and to do it freely. So I hope everyone has a great night. I hope you enjoyed the format, and I really look forward to doing future sessions shortly. Good night.